Arthur Wilkinson had built a life he was proud of, rooted in hard work and the belief that stability could weather any storm. At 33, he had a thriving career as an architect, a loving wife of 6 years, Emily, and their curious, bright-eyed son, Ethan. Their modest home in Somerset wasn't grand, but it was theirs, and it carried the warmth of shared dreams and quiet routines. Arthur and Emily had fallen into a comfortable rhythm, one where affection was steady and disagreements never lingered for long. Ethan, the glue of their small family, brought out their best, Arthur with his calm guidance and Emily with her playful charm. Arthur often thought of their life as one of mutual respect and unwavering love. Sure, there were flaws, but they were part of the texture of their marriage, nothing he couldn't overlook. Then came the night his younger brother, Thomas, called with an urgent plea. Thomas and his wife Grace had lost their home in a fire. In a rush of compassion, Arthur had immediately offered to take them in. Emily had hesitated but relented with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The following day, Thomas and Grace arrived with their few salvaged belongings. Thomas, 4 years Arthur's junior, was everything Arthur was not: loud, brash, and magnetic. Grace, on the other hand, was soft-spoken and perpetually apologetic, as though she carried the weight of the intrusion alone. The adjustment wasn't without its challenges. With 2 more adults in the house, space quickly became a premium. Arthur converted his home office into a makeshift bedroom for the couple, leaving his own work scattered between the dining room and living room. Meals became chaotic, and the once quiet evenings were replaced with Thomas's booming laughter and endless stories. Despite the disruption, Arthur welcomed the energy his brother brought, thinking it might lighten the load for everyone. But slowly, Arthur began noticing things he couldn't explain away. Emily, who rarely fussed over her appearance, started wearing makeup around the house, her hair styled even on lazy Sundays. When Thomas entered the room, she would light up, her laughter easy and unrestrained in ways that felt almost out of place. Arthur chalked it up to the novelty of having company, family, under their roof. He told himself it was nothing when he caught Emily stealing glances at Thomas during dinner, her cheeks flushing at his jokes. He ignored the pang in his chest when Thomas complimented her cooking, and Emily brushed it off with a modest laugh, her eyes lingering on his a beat too long. After all, Thomas was just being his usual charming self, and Emily was simply polite, wasn't she? Even Ethan seemed to sense the shift in their home. One evening, Arthur found him in his room, unusually quiet. When asked what was wrong, Ethan simply shrugged and said, "Mommy likes Uncle Thomas's jokes more than yours." Arthur had laughed it off then, ruffling Ethan's hair and joking, "That's because Uncle Thomas is better at silly jokes." Still, the unease lingered like a faint, persistent itch at the back of his mind. He wasn't sure when it began, whether it was the way Thomas's presence seemed to take up all the air in the room or how Emily, who once leaned on Arthur for support, now seemed buoyed by Thomas instead. For months, Arthur chose not to dwell on it. His trust in Emily ran deep, and Thomas, for all his flaws, was his brother. Family helped family. That was the way it had always been. But as he lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the sense that something intangible had begun to unravel in the fabric of their home. The question was whether it was all in his head, or whether his perfect life was about to face a storm he wasn't prepared for. The Friday that changed everything began like any other. Arthur packed for his trip to London with the same precision he applied to his work. As he kissed Emily goodbye and hugged Ethan, there was no inkling that his world was about to collapse. Emily had smiled at him with warmth, her hand resting on his chest in a way that felt reassuring. "Drive safe," she had said, her voice soft. For a moment, Arthur felt guilty for the unease he'd been harboring. Perhaps he'd been reading too much into things. The meeting in London wrapped up earlier than expected, leaving Arthur with an unplanned evening free. His first thought was to call Emily, but instead, he decided to surprise her by coming home early. The drive back was peaceful, the rain tapping gently against the windshield, and Arthur found himself thinking about how lucky he was to have her. Maybe they could steal a quiet night together without the usual noise of their crowded house. As he pulled into the driveway, the sight of Thomas's van struck him as odd. Grace was away visiting her sick mother in Birmingham, and Thomas wasn't supposed to be home either. Arthur shook off the thought, assuming Thomas had decided to relax at the house rather than go out. The house was eerily quiet when Arthur stepped inside, save for the occasional creak of the old floorboards. He noticed the faint glow of light coming from upstairs and the sound of muffled laughter. It was Emily's laugh, soft and breathy, mixed with the unmistakable timbre of Thomas's voice. Arthur paused at the foot of the stairs, his stomach tightening into a knot. Something was off. He moved slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. As he approached the bedroom, the voices became clearer, low murmurs, followed by a giggle that sent a chill up his spine. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears as he reached the slightly ajar door. Pushing the door open with trembling hands, Arthur froze. There, on the bed they had shared for years, was Emily. She was on her knees, entirely vulnerable in the worst way imaginable. Thomas was there, too, with a smugness that made Arthur's stomach churn. The intimacy of the scene burned itself into his mind, a grotesque image that made everything inside him scream to look away, but he couldn't. For a moment, neither of them noticed him. Arthur's world narrowed to the sound of his own shallow breaths and the weight of betrayal crashing down around him. When Thomas finally glanced up, his expression shifted, not to guilt but to something bordering on defiance. Emily turned, and the look on her face, a mix of shock and dread, was almost worse. Arthur couldn't speak. Words formed in his mind, angry, hurtful words that begged to be unleashed, but they caught in his throat like shards of glass. The woman he had built a life with, the brother he had trusted, both had betrayed him in the cruelest way possible. Without a word, he turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy as he descended the stairs. Behind him, he could hear Emily calling after him, her voice cracking with panic, but he didn't stop. He grabbed his car keys from the kitchen counter and left the house, the slam of the door echoing like a gunshot in the still night. Arthur drove aimlessly for hours, the rain blurring the windshield as his thoughts raced. Anger, humiliation, heartbreak, they swirled together in a storm that threatened to consume him. He thought of Ethan, sleeping soundly at his parents' house, blissfully unaware of the chaos unraveling in his family. He thought of Grace, who trusted Thomas as much as Arthur had once trusted Emily. By the time Arthur finally parked his car outside a small, nondescript hotel, the exhaustion had set in. He collapsed onto the bed, his mind replaying the scene over and over like a cruel loop. Sleep didn't come easily that night, and when it did, it was haunted by fragmented dreams of laughter and betrayal. Morning brought no clarity, only a cold, hard determination. Arthur stared at the ceiling, the weight of what had happened pressing down on him. He didn't know what his next move would be, but one thing was certain: this betrayal would not go unanswered. Arthur returned home the next day, his emotions carefully contained beneath a facade of calm. He hadn't decided on his full course of action, but he knew he couldn't let Emily or Thomas dictate the narrative. He needed to see how far they'd take their deception and how much of their guilt they'd try to conceal. When he entered the house, Emily was waiting for him in the kitchen, pacing nervously. She flinched at the sound of the door closing and turned to face him, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen. The image of her with Thomas still burned in Arthur's mind, but he forced himself to maintain composure. He needed answers. Emily was the first to speak, her voice trembling. "Arthur, I can explain." Her words hung in the air, pathetic in their futility. Arthur crossed his arms, staring at her with a blank expression. "Go on," he said flatly, his tone devoid of warmth. Emily stammered, searching for a way to frame her betrayal as anything other than what it was. It was a mistake. I don't know what came over me. Thomas and we didn't mean for this to happen." Arthur felt a wave of anger rise in his chest, but he kept his face stoic. "Didn't mean for it to happen? It didn't look like an accident to me." She bit her lip, her hands twisting the hem of her sweater. "I swear, Arthur, it's not what you think. It was the first time." "Don't lie to me," Arthur interrupted, his voice cold and steady. "I stood there long enough to see exactly what was happening. You and Thomas didn't just stumble into this." Emily's face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks. I didn't want to hurt you. It just happened." The excuses felt rehearsed, hollow, and insincere. Arthur watched her, disgusted by the crocodile tears that did nothing to lessen the weight of her betrayal. "When did it start?" he asked, his tone sharp enough to make Emily flinch. She hesitated, her eyes darting away. "It was only recently, after he moved in. It was just a few weeks ago, I swear." Arthur didn't believe her. He could see the cracks in her story, the shifting gaze, the shaky delivery. "You're lying," he said, his voice firm. "You've been making excuses to spend time with him for months. I've noticed it. You don't just slip into something like this." Emily shook her head desperately, stepping closer to him, but Arthur took a step back. Her face twisted into a mix of frustration and panic. "Arthur, please. I love you. It was a mistake, but it didn't mean anything. It doesn't mean I don't care about you." Arthur laughed bitterly at that, the sound cold and hollow. "Care about me? Is that why you brought him into our bed? Because you care so much?" Emily's tears turned into sobs, but Arthur wasn't moved. He wasn't ready to let her off the hook with her pathetic attempt at damage control. "Where's Thomas?" he asked abruptly. She froze, her reaction betraying her. He went out to clear his head," she murmured. Arthur's jaw clenched. Of course, Thomas wouldn't face him. The man was likely hiding, leaving Emily to clean up the mess. That was typical, selfish and cowardly. "Listen carefully," Arthur said, his voice cutting through Emily's sobs. "We're not done talking. But for now I need space. I'll let you know when I'm ready to deal with this properly." He left her standing in the kitchen, her tears unchecked, and went to the bedroom. It felt alien now, tainted by what he'd witnessed. He started packing a bag, his movements deliberate. He would leave, not because he was running, but because he needed distance to figure out his next steps. As he zipped up his suitcase, Emily appeared in the doorway, her voice small. "Where are you going?" "Somewhere you're not," he replied bluntly, brushing past her. She didn't follow him this time. Perhaps she realized that no amount of pleading could erase what she had done. Or perhaps she thought she still had time to regain control. Either way, Arthur didn't care. He had given her years of loyalty and love, and she had repaid him with betrayal. Now, it was his turn to take control of the situation. As he drove away, Arthur felt a strange sense of clarity. Emily's lies had solidified his resolve. He wouldn't let her twist the truth or diminish the pain she had caused. Whatever came next, Arthur knew he wouldn't go down quietly. Arthur checked into a small hotel just outside town, its anonymity offering the distance he needed to think clearly. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself to sit still, the silence in the room pressing down on him. His mind raced with images of Emily and Thomas, laughing, whispering, betraying him in his own home. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was a defilement of everything he'd worked to build. He couldn't shake the thought of Ethan. His son deserved better than this chaos. But how could Arthur shield him from a truth so devastating? And what about Grace? She had trusted Thomas, had built her life around him, only to be blindsided just as Arthur had been. The betrayal wasn't isolated. It was a ripple that threatened to shatter more lives than just his own. Arthur's anger morphed into cold calculation. He couldn't let this break him, and he wouldn't confront this recklessly. Emily and Thomas had crossed a line, and he was determined to make them both face the consequences. That evening, Arthur reached out to Grace. He had debated whether to involve her, whether it was fair to append her life with this revelation. But as much as he hated the thought of hurting her, she had a right to know. She deserved the truth. When Grace answered the phone, her voice was soft and unsuspecting. "Arthur? Is everything okay?" Arthur hesitated for a moment, the weight of his decision pressing on his chest. "Grace," he began, his tone steady but somber. "I need to talk to you about something important. It's not easy to say, but you need to know." There was a pause, a shift in her tone. "What's wrong? Is it about Thomas?" Arthur explained as delicately as he could, recounting what he had seen without adding unnecessary detail. The other end of the line was silent, except for the occasional sharp intake of breath. When Grace finally spoke, her voice was shaky but resolute. "I knew something was off," she whispered. "I just didn't want to believe it." She didn't cry, at least not while they were on the phone. Instead, her sadness was laced with anger. Anger at Thomas for his betrayal, anger at Emily for her role, and perhaps even anger at herself for not recognizing the signs sooner. "Thank you for telling me," Grace said at last. "I don't know what I'm going to do, but at least now I can stop wondering." After hanging up, Arthur felt a grim sense of relief. Grace's reaction had confirmed something for him. He wasn't alone in this. There was power in the truth, even if it was painful. The next day, Arthur began laying the groundwork for his plan. He called a lawyer to inquire about divorce proceedings, focusing on how best to protect Ethan. Custody would be his priority. He wouldn't let Emily's betrayal upend Ethan's life more than it already had. Arthur also began gathering evidence. He knew that Emily and Thomas would likely try to spin the situation to their advantage, painting their actions as mistakes or misunderstandings. But Arthur had seen enough to know this wasn't a fleeting lapse in judgment. It was deliberate, ongoing, and cruel. He combed through bank statements, emails, and even phone records, looking for any inconsistencies that could bolster his case. Every detail he uncovered seemed to chip away at the person he thought Emily was. Her carelessness, leaving behind digital traces of her deceit, stung as much as the betrayal itself. It was as if she hadn't even cared enough to hide it well. In the evenings, Arthur wrote out a timeline of events, piecing together the moments that had led to this breaking point. As he did, he began to notice patterns: Emily's increased errands, Thomas's frequent presence in the house even when he wasn't supposed to be there. It was all so painfully obvious in hindsight. Arthur's thoughts often drifted to Ethan during this time. He pictured his son's bright smile, his endless questions about the world, his unshakable belief that his parents loved each other. How could Arthur explain what had happened without destroying that innocence? The thought of Ethan being caught in the crossfire fueled Arthur's resolve. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming his life and ensuring his son wouldn't suffer for the mistakes of others. By the end of the week, Arthur felt more focused than he had in days. The anger was still there, simmering just beneath the surface, but it no longer controlled him. He had a plan, and with it, a sense of control over a situation that had initially left him reeling. Emily and Thomas had taken something from him, something he couldn't get back. But Arthur would make sure they didn't get to walk away unscathed. This wasn't the end of his story. It was the start of a new chapter. And Arthur intended to write it on his own terms. Arthur returned to the house with a quiet determination that belied the storm brewing inside him. He had spent the past week preparing, carefully organizing his thoughts and actions. Now it was time to put his plan into motion. He knew confronting Emily and Thomas outright wouldn't be enough. They would lie, downplay, and twist the truth to suit their needs. The only way to truly expose their betrayal was to let them unravel themselves. Emily greeted him cautiously when he walked through the door. Her demeanor had shifted in his absence. She was subdued, almost meek, as though waiting for him to make the first move. Arthur didn't give her the satisfaction. He spoke little and avoided unnecessary eye contact, keeping his tone neutral whenever they interacted. It unnerved her, and that was precisely the point. Thomas, on the other hand, had taken to avoiding him entirely. The man who once strutted through Arthur's home as though he owned it was now conspicuously absent during most of Arthur's waking hours. When they did cross paths, Thomas would offer a stiff nod or a mumbled greeting, but Arthur ignored him, treating him as though he were invisible. The tension in the house was palpable, and Arthur used it to his advantage. He wanted them uncomfortable, second-guessing every word and action, unsure of how much he knew or what he planned to do next. It was a slow burn, but Arthur was patient. He had learned that exposing the truth wasn't just about confrontation, it was about timing. One evening, while Emily was in the shower, Arthur made his move. He accessed her phone, taking screenshots of incriminating messages exchanged between her and Thomas. The texts confirmed what he already knew, but seeing the evidence in black and white still stung. Their messages were filled with flirty banter, plans to meet in secret, and occasional jabs at Arthur's obliviousness. It was disgusting, but it was also exactly what he needed. Arthur forwarded the screenshots to his own phone and then carefully erased any trace of his actions. He had no intention of using the messages immediately. They were ammunition for when the time was right. For now, he needed to keep playing the long game. The next step was reaching out to Grace again. Arthur knew she deserved an update, and he hoped she might be willing to assist in his plan. He called her one evening, his tone measured but sincere as he explained what he had uncovered. Grace was devastated but resolute. "I want to help," she said firmly. "Thomas has taken so much from both of us. He doesn't get to walk away from this unscathed." Together, they devised a plan. Grace would confront Thomas at a family gathering, where everyone could witness his lies unravel. Arthur would provide her with the messages he had collected, ensuring that the evidence was irrefutable. They both agreed that this was about more than just revenge. It was about reclaiming their dignity and holding Emily and Thomas accountable for their actions. The family gathering was set for the following weekend, and Arthur spent the days leading up to it preparing. He spoke with his lawyer about divorce proceedings, ensuring he had all the necessary documentation in place. He also began discreetly packing a few of his belongings, readying himself for the inevitable fallout. This wasn't a fight he planned to wage under the same roof as his betrayers. On the morning of the gathering, Arthur felt a strange sense of calm. He had done everything he could to prepare, and now it was time to let the pieces fall where they may. Emily seemed oblivious to his plans, fussing over her outfit and asking Arthur if he thought she looked appropriate for the occasion. He gave her a curt nod, biting back the urge to tell her just how inappropriate her behavior had been for their entire marriage. As they arrived at the gathering, Arthur exchanged a brief glance with Grace, who gave him a subtle nod. The stage was set, and all that was left was for the curtain to rise. The betrayal would no longer be their secret to hide. It was time for the world to know the truth. The family gathering was hosted at Arthur's parents' house, a sprawling home that often served as the backdrop for birthdays, holidays, and reunions. This time, the air buzzed with a mix of anticipation and unease, though most of the family seemed blissfully unaware of the storm about to break. Arthur moved through the crowd, keeping his composure. Grace arrived shortly after, her expression a blend of nervous determination. She had confided in Arthur earlier that morning that she hadn't slept much the night before. "I just want it to be over," she had admitted. Arthur understood. This confrontation was as much for her closure as it was for his. Emily and Thomas mingled separately, though their shared glances and hushed laughter didn't escape Arthur's notice. He felt a familiar pang of anger, but he pushed it down. This was their stage to fall from, and he wasn't going to lose his cool before the moment came. The opportunity arrived during dinner. Conversations swirled around the table as plates were passed and laughter filled the room. Grace, seated directly across from Thomas, suddenly cleared her throat. The sound cut through the chatter, drawing every pair of eyes to her. "I need to say something," Grace began, her voice steady but firm. "It's important, and it involves both Thomas and Emily." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling like a lead blanket over the table. Thomas stiffened in his seat, his eyes darting toward Arthur, then back to Grace. Emily froze mid-reach for a bread roll, her face pale. Arthur leaned back in his chair, allowing Grace to take the lead. This was her moment, and he had no intention of stealing it from her. "I found out something recently, something that shattered the trust one thought I had in my husband," Grace continued, her gaze locked on Thomas. "I've discovered that Thomas and Emily have been having an affair." Gasps rippled through the room, followed by a cacophony of whispered disbelief. Arthur's mother clapped a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. His father's face darkened, the veins in his temples pulsing. Thomas finally found his voice, though it was shaky and defensive. "Grace, what are you talking about? That's ridiculous." Grace didn't flinch. Instead, she pulled out her phone and began scrolling through it. "Don't insult my intelligence, Thomas. I have proof." She held up her phone, displaying the screenshots Arthur had provided. She passed it around the table, each relative taking turns reading the incriminating messages. The expressions that crossed their faces ranged from anger to disgust. Emily, her face now beet red, opened her mouth to speak but faltered. It's not what it looks like," she stammered, her voice barely audible. Arthur decided it was time to step in. "Don't bother, Emily. Everyone can see exactly what it is." His voice was calm but carried an edge sharp enough to cut through the noise. "You've betrayed me, our son, and everyone sitting at this table who thought they could trust you." Emily's eyes filled with tears, and she looked around the table as if searching for an ally. None were forthcoming. Even Arthur's mother, who had always been fiercely protective of her, looked away in disappointment. Thomas tried again, his tone shifting to one of desperation. "It wasn't like that, okay? It just happened. We didn't mean for it to go this far." Arthur let out a bitter laugh. "The two of you didn't mean to carry on an affair in my home, in my bed? How noble of you." The room erupted in a flurry of voices. Arthur's parents demanded answers from Thomas, while Grace calmly announced that she was filing for divorce. Emily's attempts to explain herself were drowned out by the growing uproar. Arthur sat back, watching the scene unfold. This was what he had wanted, not revenge for its own sake, but accountability. He had given Emily and Thomas every opportunity to come clean, and they had chosen lies and deceit instead. Now, their carefully constructed facade was crumbling in front of everyone they had hoped to fool. As the dust began to settle, Arthur stood, addressing the room. "I'll be filing for divorce as well," he announced. "And I'll be seeking full custody of Ethan. He deserves better than this mess." Emily looked stricken, her mouth opening and closing as though she wanted to protest but couldn't find the words. Arthur didn't give her the chance. He turned to Grace, who gave him a small, resolute nod, and together they left the room, leaving Thomas and Emily to face the wreckage of their choices. Arthur stepped outside into the cool evening air, taking a deep breath. For the first time in weeks, he felt a semblance of peace. The truth was out, and the burden of keeping it hidden no longer rested on his shoulders. He wasn't done fighting, there were still battles ahead, but for now, he allowed himself a moment to savor the victory. In the days following the gathering, the ripples of Emily and Thomas's betrayal spread through the family and beyond. Arthur had thought exposing the truth would bring some measure of relief, but the fallout was far messier than he had anticipated. Emily called him incessantly in the days after the confrontation, her voice a mix of anger, desperation, and regret. She swung wildly between pleading for forgiveness and accusing Arthur of sabotaging their family by airing their dirty laundry in front of everyone. Arthur ignored her calls, letting her words go to voicemail. He had nothing left to say to her, not now, Not while the pain was still so raw. When she couldn't reach him directly, Emily turned to mutual friends. She painted herself as a victim of circumstance, claiming she had been caught in a moment of weakness and that Arthur was blowing things out of proportion. Some friends bought into her narrative, but many saw through the thin veneer of her excuses, especially once Arthur quietly shared the evidence he'd collected. Emily's once bright social reputation began to dim. Invitations to brunches and neighborhood events dwindled. Parents at Ethan's school, many of whom had admired Emily's bubbly charm, now whispered behind her back at drop-offs and pickups. Even her closest friends seemed to pull away, unwilling to openly defend her actions. The strain of isolation wore on her, and Arthur could see it in the rare moments they crossed paths. She looked thinner, her makeup less polished, and her usual confidence had morphed into a nervous edge. Still, she clung to the idea that she could salvage the situation. One afternoon, she cornered Arthur at the house while he was packing some of his things to move into a temporary apartment. "You're not being fair," she said, blocking the doorway to the bedroom. "We can fix this, Arthur. I made a mistake, but that doesn't mean we should throw away everything we've built." Arthur barely looked up from folding a shirt. "What you threw away, Emily, wasn't just our marriage. It was trust, respect, and everything I thought we stood for." She stepped closer, her voice softening. "I know I hurt you, but we have a son together. Think about Ethan. Do you really want him to grow up in a broken home?" Arthur straightened, meeting her gaze. "A broken home is what he's been living in. It just took me a while to see it. I'm not going to let him live in an environment built on lies." Emily's expression hardened, her desperation giving way to anger. "You're punishing me for one mistake. You're acting like I didn't spend years supporting you, loving you. That has to count for something." Arthur let out a bitter laugh. "Loving me? Is that what you call it? Bringing my brother into our bed and lying about it for months? If that's your idea of love, I want no part of it." Her face fell, but she didn't try to argue further. Instead, she stepped aside, letting him pass as he carried his suitcase to the door. Arthur didn't need her approval or understanding. He was done with her attempts to rewrite the story. What mattered now was Ethan. Emily's behavior grew increasingly erratic as the divorce proceedings began. She made tearful declarations of love during custody negotiations, only to turn cold and accusatory when Arthur refused to budge. She claimed he was trying to poison Ethan against her, an accusation Arthur didn't dignify with a response. He focused on maintaining stability for Ethan, keeping their interactions as cordial as possible for his son's sake. Ethan, perceptive beyond his years, picked up on the tension despite Arthur's efforts to shield him. One evening, while Arthur was helping him with homework, Ethan paused, his pencil hovering above the page. "Dad, are you and Mom ever going to stop fighting?" Arthur hesitated, unsure of how to answer without burdening his son further. "Ethan," he said gently, "sometimes grown-ups make mistakes. Big ones. And when that happens, it's better for everyone if they take some time apart." Ethan frowned, his young mind grappling with the complexities of the situation. "But you still love me, right?" Arthur's heart ached at the question. He wrapped his arms around Ethan, holding him tightly. "Of course I do. I'll always love you, no matter what." Emily's attempts to win back sympathy grew more desperate over time. She began spreading rumors, claiming Arthur had emotionally neglected her, that his work had always come before their family. It was a transparent effort to deflect blame, but it stung nonetheless. Arthur's friends and family, however, rallied around him. They had seen enough at the gathering to understand where the fault truly lay. The final blow came when Emily's lies caught up with her at work. A close colleague, privy to the drama, exposed her behavior to management. The company, concerned about the optics of her personal scandal, quietly encouraged her to resign. Emily's once busy days were suddenly void of purpose, and she spent most of her time at home, consumed by bitterness. Arthur, meanwhile, was finding his footing. He'd moved into a comfortable apartment nearby and was working with his lawyer to ensure a favorable custody arrangement. Ethan adjusted surprisingly well, bolstered by Arthur's unwavering presence and the stability he provided. Emily's downfall wasn't something Arthur celebrated. It was simply the natural consequence of her actions. While she floundered, Arthur focused on moving forward, determined to rebuild a life free from deceit and anchored in the bond he shared with his son. While Emily floundered in the wake of the scandal, Thomas faced a reckoning of his own. The exposure at the family gathering had left him isolated and disgraced, with few places to hide. Arthur had anticipated that Thomas, ever the charmer, would attempt to weasel his way back into the good graces of those around him, but even Thomas's silver tongue couldn't undo the damage. Their parents, devastated by the betrayal, cut Thomas off almost immediately. Arthur's mother, once indulgent of her younger son's antics, refused to speak to him after the confrontation. "You've destroyed this family," she had told him coldly when he attempted to explain himself. "Do you even realize what you've done?" Their father, though quieter, was equally firm. He made it clear that Thomas was no longer welcome at family events and that any attempts to reconcile would be met with silence. The betrayal wasn't just about Arthur, it was a stain on the family's integrity, and their parents weren't willing to look the other way. Grace, meanwhile, wasted no time moving forward with the divorce. Arthur kept in touch with her, offering support as she navigated the process. Grace's resolve impressed him. Despite the emotional toll, she refused to let Thomas's betrayal define her future. She moved out of the shared home, taking the few belongings she wanted, and filed for sole ownership of the remaining assets. Thomas, left to fend for himself, quickly spiraled. His charm, once his greatest asset, now worked against him. Friends who had previously admired his charisma and confidence turned their backs, unwilling to associate with someone who had betrayed his own family so brazenly. His social circle shrank to a handful of acquaintances, most of whom seemed more interested in gossiping about his downfall than supporting him. Professionally, Thomas's reputation took a hit as well. He worked as a contractor, relying heavily on word-of-mouth referrals. But the scandal spread quickly through their small community, and clients began to second-guess hiring someone with such a tarnished name. Jobs dried up, and Thomas's once comfortable lifestyle began to crumble. Desperate and cornered, Thomas reached out to Arthur one evening. The call came while Arthur was helping Ethan with a school project. Seeing Thomas's name flash across the screen, Arthur hesitated before answering. "Arthur," Thomas began, his voice strained. "I need to talk to you." Arthur's grip tightened on the phone. "I don't think we have anything to discuss." "Please," Thomas pressed, the desperation in his tone palpable. "I know I screwed up. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm drowning here. I've lost everything. Mom and Dad won't even look at me. Arthur cut him off. "You did this to yourself, Thomas. Did you think there wouldn't be consequences? You betrayed me, your wife, our family, and you expect sympathy." Thomas stammered, trying to find the right words. "I'm not asking for sympathy. Just a chance to make things right." Arthur's voice was calm, but the anger beneath it was unmistakable. "Making things right isn't something you can just ask for, Thomas. It's something you prove, over time, by showing that you've changed. And frankly, I don't think you're capable of that." Thomas fell silent, and Arthur took the opportunity to end the call. "Don't contact me again. Focus on cleaning up your own mess. Goodbye." Hanging up, Arthur felt a wave of finality. He didn't feel triumphant. There was no satisfaction in watching his brother self-destruct. But there was relief in knowing he no longer bore any responsibility for Thomas. In the months that followed, Thomas's situation worsened. He was forced to move out of the rental property he had shared with Grace, unable to keep up with the payments. He bounced between temporary accommodations, each one a step further from the life of comfort he had once known. His attempts to rebuild relationships were met with resistance at every turn, as people questioned his motives and sincerity. Grace, meanwhile, began to thrive. She focused on her career and reconnected with old friends, finding strength in the support system she had rebuilt. Occasionally, she and Arthur would catch up over coffee, their conversations reflective but hopeful. They were bound by shared pain, but also by a mutual determination to rise above it. For Arthur, seeing Thomas's downfall served as a reminder of the importance of integrity and accountability. He wasn't one to revel in someone else's misery, but he also knew that Thomas's suffering was the natural outcome of his choices. As he tucked Ethan into bed one night, Arthur felt a quiet sense of closure. His brother's betrayal had cut deep, but it no longer defined him. Arthur's focus was on the future, on rebuilding his life and ensuring that Ethan grew up surrounded by love and stability. Thomas's chapter in his life was closing, and Arthur was ready to move forward without him. Arthur found himself navigating a life that was quieter, but not empty. In the weeks following the fallout, the shock of betrayal gradually gave way to a new rhythm. Ethan was his anchor, his laughter and curiosity reminding Arthur that not everything was broken. The first few weeks in his new apartment were tough. The space felt stark and impersonal, a far cry from the home he had poured his heart into. Arthur spent his evenings unpacking boxes and hanging up Ethan's favorite artwork on the walls, trying to make the space feel less temporary. Ethan adjusted surprisingly well, splitting his time between Arthur and Emily. Arthur was careful not to speak poorly of her around their son, but it was impossible to fully shield him from the tension. One Friday evening, after Ethan had gone to bed, Arthur sat alone in the living room, staring at a half-empty glass of wine. The silence was oppressive, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his emotions. Anger, sadness, and exhaustion swirled together, but beneath it all was a quiet determination. He had survived the worst of it, and now it was time to start living again. Arthur began by reconnecting with old friends. People he hadn't seen in years, college buddies, colleagues, even neighbors, reached out after hearing about what had happened. Their support was a lifeline, reminding Arthur that he wasn't alone. One friend, Mark, insisted on dragging him out for a hike one Saturday morning. Arthur protested at first, but the crisp air and the physical exertion were a welcome distraction. For the first time in a long while, he felt the knot in his chest begin to loosen. Professionally, Arthur threw himself into his work. Designing buildings had always been his passion, and now it became his refuge. He found solace in the precision and creativity of his craft, losing himself in blueprints and sketches. His focus paid off, and a major client praised his latest project, a modern library that would serve as a centerpiece for the community. Arthur also sought out therapy, something he had hesitated to do in the past. Sitting across from a stranger and unpacking the chaos of his life was daunting, but it turned out to be one of the best decisions he made. The therapist helped him process his anger and grief, guiding him toward acceptance. It wasn't about forgetting what had happened, but about learning to live with it without letting it define him. Ethan, ever perceptive, noticed the subtle changes in Arthur's mood. "You're smiling more, Dad," he said one evening as they played a board game. Arthur chuckled, ruffling Ethan's hair. "I've got a good reason to," he replied, looking at his son. As the months passed, Arthur found moments of joy in the little things. He and Ethan developed new traditions, like Saturday morning pancake breakfasts and impromptu movie nights. Arthur took up running again, something he hadn't done since his college days, and discovered it helped clear his mind. He even joined a local community group, volunteering his architectural skills to help design affordable housing for low-income families. Emily's attempts to win back his trust continued sporadically, but Arthur kept his distance. He maintained polite, neutral communication with her for Ethan's sake, but he refused to let her back into his life. She would have to face the consequences of her actions without relying on him as a crutch. One day, while organizing old family photos, Arthur stumbled upon a picture of himself, Emily, and Ethan at a park. They looked so happy, so full of hope. For a moment, his chest tightened, but then he smiled softly. The life he had imagined was gone, but a new one was taking shape. One built on honesty, resilience, and a renewed sense of purpose. By the time autumn rolled around, Arthur felt more like himself than he had in years. He had weathered the storm, and while the scars of betrayal remained, they no longer dictated his every thought. He was moving forward, step by step, and for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful about what lay ahead.